After qualifying for the 2022 FIFA World Cup, the amount of hype surrounding Canada's national men's soccer team has expectedly reached all-time highs. People all across Canada are excited and ecstatic for a chance to watch Canada play in the FIFA World Cup on the world's biggest stage. And a lot of people have a lot of different expectations for this team going into this tournament. So to gauge how Canadians feel and how Canadian soccer fans feel about Canada going into this World Cup, I made a survey that was put around Twitter and some of the Canadian soccer subreddits, and these are the results. So I split the survey up into 3 sections. The first is asking individual questions about an individual person's fandom. The second section is predictions for this World Cup in general, how they think Canada is going to fare at this upcoming World Cup in Qatar and who is going to be on the roster. And the third and final section is predictions for the future of Canada's men's national soccer team. So the first question in the fandom section was, are you planning to watch Canada's games at the upcoming World Cup this winter? And of 111 respondents, 106 obviously said yes. I don't know the other 5 who chose to do this survey despite not wanting to watch Canada play in the World Cup, but you know, you do you. Following up, do you usually watch at least one game every World Cup? 98.2% said yes. The other 2%, again, why are you on Canadian soccer subreddits? I mean, whatever, you do you, but a little odd that that wasn't a 100% asked question. But as you can see, Canadian soccer fans obviously do watch the World Cup en masse. Now things get interesting. The next question I asked was, how closely did you follow the Canadian men's national team prior to this World Cup qualifying run? Because obviously you'd expect that the national team would gain a lot more attention, and it did gain a lot more media attention as the World Cup qualifying campaign went on. So instead we're going to see how many people on these big subreddits that are bastions of Canadian soccer actually were there and were regularly following the national team prior to this World Cup qualifying window. And almost surprisingly, 2/3 of people, 66%, did say they regularly followed the Canadian national team prior to this window. Of the remainder, 27% said they had a pretty general idea of what was going on with the national team, but they didn't really watch the games ever. And 8% were like, no, I didn't follow it whatsoever before this World Cup qualifying window. So obviously the amount of eyeballs on the national team has increased throughout this window, but also there was a very strong supporting group who were very loyal, who had been sticking around for years beforehand. And finally, I also asked if people follow the women's national team in Canada, and the results for this are pretty expected. About 24% of people said they regularly follow the women's national team, keep up to date with what they do every window. The majority of people, or 57%, said that they generally watch the Olympics and the World Cup and big tournaments, but other than that, just kind of keep an eye on them, but don't really religiously follow what's going on outside of major tournaments. And 17.4% said they do not follow the women's national team whatsoever. So more people following the men's team than the women's team, I mean, expectedly, given that this is a survey about the men's national team, but I'm surprised that even prior to the World Cup qualifying run, it seems like the men's national team still had more people following generally along than the women's national team. Maybe not so much amongst the general population, but amongst the hardcore super football fans in Canada, it seems like the men's team actually had a slightly stronger following throughout, non-major tournament sort of play than the women's team does. Although that obviously could also be due part that with the women's team, you're pretty much guaranteed to see major tournaments. So if you're kind of a major tournament person, you're going to watch them with the women's team, but for the men's team, you kind of have to do a little bit of reaching. So that is the fandom breakdown for Canadian soccer fans who completed this survey. Moving on to predictions, but before I do that, I need to talk to you about the partner of this channel, MatchBets.com. This video is made in partnership with MatchBets.com. MatchBets.com is a player versus player gaming model gambling site, which allows players to match other players' bets or create their own bets for other players to match. When matching bets, the house fee is significantly lower at 2% as opposed to 8% with regular gambling sites, allowing players to keep more of their winnings. On MatchBets, you can bet on a wide variety of sports from hockey to soccer to tennis, and as well as betting against other players, you also can bet against the house in a traditional sports book. If you're interested in using MatchBets, you can sign up using my link down below in the description, and by signing up using my promo code TorontoSportsGuy, which will give you a 100% match bonus up to $4,000. So go ahead and sign up to MatchBets.com to start player versus player betting today. Now, for predictions for the World Cup and how Canada will fare this fall/winter, there seemed to be two main camps, and it was the two most logical answers. 52.3% of people think that Canada is going to be eliminated in the group stage, and 43.1% of people think that Canada is going to make the round of 16. Both of those are equally acceptable answers, and it seems to be a pretty even split down the middle of Canadian soccer fans who think we're going to, first World Cup in 30 odd years, it's going to be around a 16 exit, and another group of people who have a bit of hope for this team and think that a round of 16 finish is entirely possible. 3 people said that Canada was going to make the quarterfinals, and then 1 person each said that they were going to make the semifinals, and 1 person said that they were going to make the finals. So those two very optimistic people, but the vast majority of fans think that the round of 16 is as far as Canada is going to go in this World Cup. Next, I want to know, because with a large break between the last octagonal games happening in March and the World Cup happening in November, things can change for the national team picture in terms of what players are in the picture and what players are not in the picture. So I asked, which player who was a regular in the octagonal do you think is the least likely to end up in the final squad for the World Cup? And there were 2 players that stood out with 26.9% and 28.7% of the vote. 26.9% of the vote, Derek Cornelius. That makes sense. The center back was kind of a fringe player, but was pretty regularly named in the 23-man squad, although didn't get that much playtime for Canada, so he's a guy who could pretty easily be swapped out. The other one is a little surprising, Lucas Cavallini, who was by far the most selected, 28.7%. Obviously, after a great 2019 post-COVID break with the Canadian national team, was not at the same level scoring goals, and the emergence of Kyle Larin and the continued improvement of Jonathan David made Cavallini a little obsolete. And now with other young strikers such as Ike Ugbo coming up through the fray, the place for Cavallini on this team, especially if his form doesn't improve with Vancouver, is falling away. So Cavallini may or may not be on the final team. I would expect him to be, just because of the veteran presence he adds and also just how big of a part of this team building up he has been. But I can see why such a large number of fans think that Cavallini is not going to make the final World Cup squad. 20.4% of people, are just over 1 in 5, said that they didn't think anyone who was a regular in the octagonal was going to miss out on the World Cup squad. That seems like a pretty likely option as well. And then the Liam Fraser got 9.3% of the vote, and Liam Miller got 8.3% of the vote. 2 players who, again, regularly in the lineup, but like Cornelius, are kind of fringe, don't get as many minutes. Although I think Fraser and Miller both do get a bit more minutes than Cornelius, but again, guys who, if newer players can come up in the intermittent few months, it's pretty easily to see them falling out of the lineup. My next question was, which player who has not yet been called up to the national team do you think is most likely to end up in the final World Cup squad? And this one had a lot of people writing in, guys who had already been capped by the national team. Maybe it was just 1 or 2 caps, but people wrote in Schaffelberg and Waterman and guys like that in this question, and those guys have already been in the World Cup squad. Those aren't really what I was going for. The leading respondent, though, with 36.7% of the vote, was Shaquille Marshall, the young 17-year-old Toronto FC fullback/winger who's really been busting onto everyone's radars this season. I mean, he has been hurt for the past month and a bit, but give him a nice run of games over the summer, he could very much be an interesting piece on the World Cup squad. Daniel Jennison got 19.4% of the vote. I know there's still question marks about whether or not he'll actually commit to Canada, but the Sheffield United striker is a very possible addition to this team, and I think that kind of joins in with the thinking Cavallini might not make it, is if Jennison commits to Canada and goes to the World Cup for Canada, that could lead to Cavallini not making the final squad. The goalies, Sebastian Breza got 11.2% of the vote and Thomas Hasal got 5% of the vote. Could be possible that either of those goalies could get a shot. I mean, the goaltender situation right now, there seems to be 4 guys fighting for 3 spots with Borjan, Kripo, Pantemis, and Dane St. Clair, but Breza and Hasal are 2 young guys who both very well could burst onto the scene and become a top 3, top 2 goaltender for Canada. And then Marcelo Flores did get 9.2% of the vote. I did release this survey right before he was fully committed to Mexico. Obviously now that looks like it's not going to happen, but Marcelo Flores, at least 9 people had hoped that he'd choose Canada over Mexico, but it seems like that was incorrect. And finally, for predicting the players who are going to Qatar section, I asked which Fringe players did you think were most likely to be in the roster, and this was a check all that apply. So these are guys who maybe were called up to a few or one of the windows for the octagonal, but weren't in the lineup every single time. And Ishmael Kone got 61.2% of the vote. His showing in the final window was fantastic, and so it seems like a lot of Canadian fans are really excited for him and how big of an asset to this team he was going to be moving forward. Ayo Akanola also got 36% of the vote, another young striker who probably the only reason why he wasn't in the octagonal was because he got hurt at the Gold Cup and was out until like a month ago. But Ayo Akanola getting back, getting healthy, if he gets into the September window and gets into some friendlies, I could very well see him in the September window, and then really it's a toss-up whether or not he'll actually get into the final World Cup squad. Dane St. Clair got 43.7% of the vote. Interesting to see if people think that he is going to pass Pantemis as the regular for that 3rd spot on the national team roster. I mean, obviously, he does have some national team experience, and he is a nice young goalie on the rise, so it'll be interesting to see who wins the Pantemis-St. Clair duel for that 3rd spot, if that's what the 3rd spot duel does become. David Weatherspoon got 32% of the vote, another guy who's just consistent in the midfield, European experience. He's a guy who, you know, he's not a game breaker, but he's never a bad choice to have in your national team roster for Canada. And then Christian Gutierrez, Zachary Brockyard, and Jacob Schaffelberg all got between 15 and 20%. All interesting, young-ish, wide players. One of them probably will end up cracking final World Cup squad. It'll be interesting to see which one it is. James Pantemis only got 4 votes, so people seem to be picking St. Clair over him. And then Charles Andreas Brim only got 1 vote, which was interesting. I guess a lot of people think that Akanola and possibly Jennison are going to fill up the striker spots, and that leaves Brim as the odd man out. Now, I also asked people to pick a roster, and how I did this was I basically said vote which formation you think Canada's going to use, and then vote which players you think are going to go in each position. And I mean, okay, a lot of people didn't seem to understand what a number 2 or a number 3 was, because they were saying that Jonathan David should be our number 3, which I don't think you want Jonathan David as center back. But long story short, the picked formation, or the formation that had the most votes, was a 3-5-2, but then in terms of players picked, people only picked 2 center midfielders, and it was very obvious based on the players picked that people wanted a 3-4-3 based on the players who had the most votes for each position, even though the 3-5-2 had more votes as a formation. So throughout, the second highest voted formation was the 3-4-3, which fits the players picked better, and this was the final formation that was picked. So all total, 50 people went and did picking every single player's position. All 50 of them said Borjans would be in net, no surprises there. Alistair Johnston was the most selected center back with 48 votes. Vittoria and Miller had 42 and 40 votes respectively, so that solidifies the back 3. No surprises there. That seems to be what Canada was going with for most of the octagonal. For the center of midfield, Eustachio had 48 votes and Hutchinson had 38, so those two became the 2 center midfielders. Hutchinson actually was the tied for 11th ranked player, but the drop between him and the next guy was pretty significant, so Hutchinson just barely squeaks into the starting 11, but Hutchinson, yes, still is a general consensus starting 11 guy for Canada. Wingbacks, Sam Adekugbe had 38 votes. He was a very popular pick. People seem to be very high on him after the last couple windows. And Tajon Buchanan had 43 votes. Again, people seem to be really high on him, although as more of people seem to be picking him more in an offensive role, which is again why 3-4-3 instead of 5-3-2. And then up top, Alphonso Davies. Most people want him as a forward. 50 votes. Again, everyone picking Alphonso Davies. Jonathan David had 48 votes. I don't know who the 2 people who didn't think Jonathan David should be in the starting 11 are, but he probably should have been at 52. And then Kyle Larin got 43 votes. Now, interestingly, there were 2 players who were fringe, both at 28 votes, who were the only players above like 6 outside of the starting 11. And those 2 players who were literally 50% of the people voted for them, Jonathan Osorio and Richie Larea. So Osorio, obviously, if you play 3 in the midfield, he's the 3rd guy who gets scooped up there. Richie Larea, the lack of play at Nottingham Forest, and the immense rise of Sam Adekugbe seem to have knocked him out of most people's starting 11, but he is still right on the cusp of the starting 11 for Canada. Other players who got votes: Mark-Anthony Kaye had 6 votes, Scott Kennedy had 5, Daniil Henry had 4, so a couple center back options being thrown around in there. Ishmael Kone had 3, Junior Hoylett had 2. I know, sad that Junior Hoylett only got 2 people voting for him, but he is a little older and he's a great substitute and a great mentor for this national team, but I think the era of Junior Hoylett being a regular starter has come and gone. And 3 players got 1 vote: Liam Fraser, Sam Piette, and Lucas McNaughton. Someone said that Lucas McNaughton, who has never started or has never even been called up to the Canadian national team, was going to be a starting 11 guy at the World Cup. That was an interesting pick for me, but you know what? Put it in there. And finally, the last section I have is the future. Following this World Cup, how do people think that this generation of Canadian soccer is going to go? What will this team accomplish? So the first question I asked was, when all their careers are said and done, obviously Kyle Larin just set the record for most goals for the national team, passing Dwayne De Rosario. So when all their careers are said and done, which player is going to be holding the record who's actively on the Canadian national team? 78.3% of people voted for Jonathan David. That makes sense. Yes, he did get passed last year by Kyle Larin, but David is significantly younger, has significantly more upside. Kyle Larin had a great year, so I think Kyle Larin right now is going to hold it, but pretty soon Jonathan David is going to pass Kyle Larin, run away with the record, and then it might take a long ass time for someone to come and pass him. 16% of people said Kyle Larin was going to hold the record, so still a solid amount of people think that Larin is going to hold on to the record and David isn't going to pass him, but that seems to be the more unlikely option. 4.7% of people said Alphonso Davies. Davies, of course, currently is tied for the Canada all-time assist record with Junior Hoylett. Davies is going to definitely end up a top 5 goal scorer for Canada. Just the fact that he's not really a striker, he can play fullback, and he does play fullback on occasion, means that he's not forward scoring as many goals as David and Larin are. Those 2 are more traditional goal scorers. Davies, of course, is going to have a very long career for Canada, is going to be one of the greatest goal scorers we've ever seen, but compared to what Jonathan David and Kyle Larin, where all they do is score, is, yeah, it makes sense that Davies didn't get the most number of votes. And there was one other player that got a vote. One person voted for Tajon Buchanan, which, good on ya. Buchanan is a very good talent. I don't know if he's, again, kind of the same issue as Davies, plays a little too far back, can kind of be a fullback or a winger off to the side a bit, not going to score as many goals as David or Larin typically. I also asked, how many consecutive World Cups is Canada going to qualify for now? So obviously we've qualified for 2022. We're assuming that we'll qualify for 2026 as a host, so the fewest number we can have is 2, and then anyone who voted 2 means that they think that after these 2 is kind of a fluke, Canada's not going to qualify. However, remember, of course, that the World Cup is expanded 48 teams, with CONCACAF getting 6 slots for 2026 onwards. So only 7.4% of people said that Canada was only going to qualify for 2 consecutive World Cups now and not qualify in 2030, which, yeah, that seems pretty expected, especially given how young our core players are. 34.3% of people said Canada's going to qualify for the next 3 World Cups and then not qualify in 2034. So, you know, makes sense. 21.3% said we're going to qualify for the next 4 up to 2034, and then 37% said we are going to qualify for 5+ World Cups, which means that Canada is going to become a consistent contender in the FIFA World Cup finals. That actually makes sense because, thinking about it, yes, they are expanding the World Cup to 48 teams. CONCACAF is being expanded to 6 slots instead of just 3. And so given the explosive growth of Canadian football recently, the start of the Canadian Premier League, the change of development pathways in the country, the League One still starting up, it does make sense that Canada could consistently be a top 6 team in CONCACAF for the foreseeable future. So yes, qualifying for 3, 4, 5+ World Cups in a row seems very much in the realm of possibility. And the final question I asked was, how will Canada fare at the 2023 Gold Cup? Now that we've won the octagonal, do people think that we are going to translate that into winning the Gold Cup? The answer is no. So again, much like the World Cup group stage round of 16 being split, there was a split here, with 41.7% of people thinking we were going to get eliminated in the semifinals, and 40.7% of people thinking we were going to make it to the finals but then lose and come in 2nd place. And 2.8% of people said we were going to get eliminated in the quarterfinals. So those people think that despite the great octagonal run, Canada still is going to not make the Final Four in CONCACAF, which is, odd. But seems like a lot more hope for the Gold Cup now moving forward as people see that Canada can, and people think that Canada can regularly compete with the USA and Mexico and be solidly in the top 3 in CONCACAF. So there you have it. Generally positive vibes for Canadian national team fans going into this first ever World Cup. It seems like, despite a lot of people saying, oh, Canada's freaking out saying they're going to go so far in the World Cup, it seems like our reactions and our expectations are pretty reasonable. You know, half of us thinking that we could get to the round of 16, half of us thinking that it's done in the group stage. So no one really is too far out there except those few guys who said we were going to be in the semifinals or win the whole freaking thing. But even for the Gold Cup, it seems like we are mediating ourselves. We're not, you know, going and saying, rah, rah, we're #1 in CONCACAF now, and it's going to be like that forever. No, it seems like our expectations for this team are pretty down to earth and just be top 3 in CONCACAF and consistently be in the top 3 in CONCACAF. And I think for Canada, that is a great spot to be. I think if we are consistently challenging the USA and challenging Mexico and just kind of in the mix with those 2 teams, that is perfectly where Canada should be and where Canada wants to be. So this survey gives me a lot of hope that people aren't getting too overly hyped. We're going to go to the World Cup, get knocked out in the group stage. People are going to be like, oh, I thought this team was going to be great and get to a quarterfinal. No, people's expectations are mediated, and it's kind of this, we'll take the success as they come. So that is it for this video. As always, if you'd like to hit like, if you want to see more of my stuff, hit subscribe, follow me on Twitter, link is down below in the description, and I will see you next time.